Hello and welcome to UCTV Alive for Kids. It's great to have your company. I'm Dr. Louise Grimmer from the University of Tasmania, and today on the show I'm joined by Dr. Vishnu Prahalad from the University of Tasmania. Vishnu is a lecturer in physical geography. Vishnu, welcome to the show. It's great to have you today.
Wonderful to be here, Louise.
Really looking forward to your presentation. Today, Vishnu, you're going to tell us all about wetlands. What makes a wetland a wetland? What lives in them? What do they get up to? Why does any of this matter? And importantly, to what question is wetland the answer? Now, before I hand over to Vishnu for his presentation, just a reminder that we'll have our usual 5-minute break at the end of the presentation for you to post your questions onto the chat function. And if you can put your first name, your grade and your school, that would be wonderful. We always love to find out where you are tuning in from. And we'll finish today's program at 10 o'clock. So, Vishnu, I'm going to hand over to you for your presentation on wetlands.
Thank you, Louise. Wonderful to be here. I'll start off by pointing to the duck there, and that is the shell duck, or sometimes called as the mountain duck. It is the largest duck we have in Tasmania. I love ducks, and I don't know about you guys, but ducks are so wonderful. They are the most adorable creatures, and that's part of the reason why I got interested in wetlands. Because I love ducks, and when I got more involved in wetlands, I found out lots of other wonderful things that I grew passionate about, and I'll talk more about them as we go. So today I wanted to frame my talk on the question of to what question is wetland the answer. I'll come back to that a bit later. So I want to structure it by looking at what makes a wetland, what lives in them, what do they get up to, and why does any of this matter. So first up, a simple principle is that wetlands have hydric soils. So a lot of this is determined by what we cannot see, which is under the ground. If you've done any gardening, you know there's lots of things in the soil that we need to look after. In the context of wetlands, hydric soils are what make wetlands wetlands. Why are they hydric? Because there's a lot of water in there, and because you have water, it pushes out the air. So in non-wetland environments, you have a lot of air in the soil, so it's called aerobic soils. But in wetlands, because you have water that displaces the air, you have anaerobic soils, which is otherwise called as hydric soils. Because you have this special soil in wetlands, you have also special plants, which is the wetland plants there. So two things to note, you have wet soils and wetland plants, and that is your definition of a wetland. So I've spoken to a lot of wetland ecologists, and their key point to note in terms of wetlands is that you just have to keep adding water, right? So water falls everywhere on your house, in forests and so on, but probably it sort of rolls off and then it's dry for a long period. But in a wetland environment, you just keep adding water, enough water to make the soil hydric, and then to attract wetland plants to develop there. So what kind of water? We can add fresh water, or you can add seawater, and there's a lot of seawater wetlands, which I'll talk about. Or you can have a bit of a mix. And when you have a bit of a mix, which is fresh and seawater, then we call it brackish water. And that's an interesting type of water, which is not entirely fresh, but also not entirely salty. All right. So where are the wetlands in Tasmania? So if you've got a map like this in your school or your house, you look at it and you see a lot of mountains, you see a lot of forests, and you ask the question, where exactly are the wetlands? And to that, I can say that they are all over the place. And this is a map we put together only of the mapped wetlands. And there's a lot of wetlands which we haven't mapped because we haven't been there, or if we've been there, we hadn't been collecting data to bring back and then put it back into the system. Okay. So why are these wetlands? Just to remind you, because they've got hydric soils and wetland plants, right? Because we can't see soils all the time. When we go out to do the mapping, we are only looking for plants. When we observe the plants, the right type of plants, we know that there are hydric soils sitting beneath the plants. So using plants as proxies or cues, we are able to identify all of these areas as wetlands as opposed to forests or grasslands or other environments. The bottom line here is that in the context of Tasmania, we do have a lot of wetlands, more wetlands per capita than any other state or territory in Australia. So we're spoiled for it. So to put a number on it, the bottom line is that we've got 5 to 10% of Tasmania as wetlands. This is also roughly the global average. In terms of the global landmass, about 5% of them are wetlands. Right. This is another way of imagining where exactly wetlands are around our environment. So this is where we are around the Derwent Estuary if you are in Hobart and surrounds. So you can see the Derwent Estuary is itself a large wetland right in the middle there. But also you have all sorts of rivers and creeks flowing into the estuary, and they are wetlands too. But also you have seagrasses that are the green patches around the environment there. So all of these are wetlands, right? And so what is not captured here, and you will notice this when you go out walking around the coast in summer, is that we've got a lot of micro wetlands. So if you go, looking for rock pools or walking along shoreline, that's an example of a micro wetland there near Calvert's Beach. It's just like a size of a small bucket, but just enough soil there so the plants are able to survive, and just enough sea spray coming in to keep adding water. Remember, adding water, in this case seawater. So you have a micro wetland. So look out for them when you go out, and keep in mind that some of these micro wetlands you see have never been mapped, right? So maybe we can start a citizen science initiative that you can contribute to map all these micro wetlands and the plants and the critters that live in them, right? So just on this, there's another example of wetlands that we need to remember that are not really mapped but are still wonderful. And these are backyard wetlands. So we'll come back to this later in question time as another thing for you guys to do over summer, to see if you can make yourself a nice backyard wetland. I've got a couple at home, and I can talk to you more about how you can make your own backyard wetland. Then there's a lot of these around the place, and they're not necessarily mapped. So what I wanted to do today was to start off by defining wetlands and give you a sense of where you can find them in the environment. Okay. So now I want to give you some examples of the wetlands that we find in Tasmania. So here is an example of what you call a freshwater wetland. This is right behind Wineglass Bay Beach. Most of you probably have likely been to Wineglass Bay Beach. I've been there a few times, and you go there, it's nice, it's a nice enough beach, you look at it for 5 minutes, it's rather pretty, and then you get a bit bored. What are you going to do? What I tend to do is to go and look for the wetlands behind the beach. And here it is, Hazard's Lagoon, which is a wonderful, remarkable environment, and you don't have all the crowds and so on. It's just, you're just by yourself, and the beautiful plants and the lovely environment there. So just remember, I mentioned adding water. So where does the water come from here, come into the Hazard's Lagoon here, is the neighboring upland environment. So the water's falling there, and it's all pooling into the Hazard's Lagoon, right? And as it does that, you have the hydric soil and you have the wetland plants. So what are the wetland plants here? I'm going to make a few references to plants. You can make a note of them, and some of these you can actually put in your backyard wetlands if you do take that project up. So water ribbons, and they are a classic wetland plant. You'll see them all across the place, and they're a good indicator that the water is fresh. If you see water ribbons, it's invariably a freshwater wetland, right? You can also see rushes like Baumia and Schoenoplectus, and some wonderful little birds like the swallow sitting on the water ribbon. We have marsupial lawns in Tasmania if you go camping, like for instance in Narrabuntapu National Park, up near Launceston. You see this wonderful grassland, right? So there are some lovely wetland plants here. Prickfoot if you do walk around this lawn barefoot, you will know why it's called prickfoot. It's actually a really nice environment. I really love interacting with nature barefoot. And you get pricked, and then you look down and there's this prickly plant which is called prickfoot. And then you've got these other wonderful little plants, Ciliara, Isolepis. Think of these as bonsai, right? And stop, kneel down, lie down if you like, and look at them close. And there's these wonderful bonsai environments around these what are called as marsupial lawns. Why are they called marsupial lawns? Because there's a lot of marsupials there, and hundreds of them, and they're chewing at the grass all the time, and they're maintaining that lawn by the process of grazing and chewing on them. You have wallabies, kangaroos, and then the wonderful wombats, right? So the first time I went to Narrabuntapu National Park, there were hundreds of them. And right now they're suffering from a disease, unfortunately, so hopefully they'll bounce back to their glorious populations that were there not so long ago. There's also plants in the water, not just above the water. So in the water you'll see pondweed and milfoil, and these are some really good plants to put in your backyard wetlands too. They like it wet, they want to be submerged, and they provide really good structure and habitat, if you like, for tadpoles and insects and so on. Right. So the third example of the wetlands that we have widespread around Tasmania is what is called as tidal freshwater wetland. These are freshwater wetlands, they're really fresh, but what's happening here is that the tides come in and out twice a day, right? So the tide's coming in and the seawater is really heavy, and it's pushing the fresh water up twice a day. And as the fresh water is being pushed up, it floods these areas and creates what is called as tidal freshwater wetlands. Interesting, isn't it? So what are some of the plants here? There's Phragmites, Typha, and these are all what is called emergent. Emergent because we can see them, they're above the surface. There's also floating wetland plants. Again, these are some good plants to have in our backyard wetlands. There's Ondufia, which is a very common wetland plant. It's a beautiful yellow flower as well. The other interesting thing is that below the water you have these submerged aquatic beds. And if you've driven past the Bridgewater Bridge and you've seen those hundreds of water birds floating around, and often they've got their head in the water, and that's what they're doing. They're feeding off on the grass and the insects around the grasses as well. So the next time you see a swan or a duck with its head under the water, you know what they're up to, right? And I've had the privilege of walking around this environment. It's wonderful in there, and I had one of the greatest surprises of my life when I was walking around wetlands this high, and I opened, and then what did I see? I saw a swan nest. Look at that. And I looked at that and I thought, surely dinosaurs are extinct, but that's what it looks like, right? Like a dinosaur nest and egg.
How big was the egg, Vishnu?
It was quite big. Yeah, it was this big.
Oh wow!
And I've been told that the Aboriginal people harvest them as protein. And they still do around some parts of Australia and Tasmania.
And how big was the nest?
Oh, the nest was really large.
Wow.
and at least 1.5 meters tall.
Oh,
so,
that would have been quite an amazing thing to see.
And you can sort of understand why they're doing it, because they want to keep it above the water level.
Of course.
Yes. And away from the predators and so on. It's a marvelous engineering, and I've got a lot more respect for swans after I've seen that. Just remarkable birds, and this is a close-up of the nest with one egg. I respectfully took those photos and left the nest. Just to keep on the theme of the different types of wetlands, here's another one. I mentioned brackish, and here's an example of that. Again, the plants are a giveaway, right? So this is why it's nice to know your plants. Then you can see the plants, and it tells you what's happening in the soil, what's happening with rainfall and the tides and so on. So what are the main characters here? There's juncus, or also called as sea rush, because it's a sort of salty environment and it's a rush. You have other small pretty plants like monkey flower. Again, if you're making note of backyard pond plants, monkey flower is a good one, also available in nurseries. There's scutula, water buttons, another pretty one. And then as you come further along the coast to our really coastal environments, heavily influenced by the sea, then you get into salt marsh, right? So this is a typical salt marsh around Lauderdale in the Derwent Estuary, where you have these lawns. An interesting thing to note here is that a lot of these plants are edible, right? When Abel Tasman came across and looked around Tasmania, a part of his notes was saying as he went into this environment, he saw all these edible plants. So he recognized all those years ago that this was an edible landscape, and he harvested these herbs which they ate as part of their diet. You can still eat them, but you've got to be aware of the contaminants that might be, so you want to harvest them from areas that are sustainable but also pollution free. And the interesting thing about some of these plants is I mentioned bonsai, and that's the interesting thing about wetlands is that yes, they're not as big and magnificent as forests, but you've got to recognize them for their own sort of characteristics. So in this case, we've got the shrub. That shrub can be 6 meters wide, up to 1.5 meters, 2 meters tall, and you go into them, and they are a remarkable bonsai tree, and sometimes we get them as bonsai shrubland or forests that are old growth. A lot of these shrubs are about 150, 200 years old, and we're working out how old they might be, potentially 400 years. So here we are, we talk about old growth forests, but we have old growth wetlands, right? And that's another interesting story of our wetlands. And I mentioned that in terms of the salt marsh, it's not just these classic expanses, but also you get nooks and crannies all around the coast where you have salt marsh plants. There's a miniature salt marsh, if you like. Okay, so finally, as you get further into the sea, if you've been kayaking or snorkeling, you'd probably recognize this type of wetland, which is a seagrass wetland. We have intertidal seagrass, which is Zostra, and you got subtidal seagrass, and you've got a few species. Posidonia is perhaps the most dominant and important one. And it's a remarkable habitat, right? So in Northern Australia, you get dugongs and so on, but in Tasmania, you still get some remarkable species like these rays and such. So if you combine all of these wetlands and put them one next to the other, in terms of hydrology, the type of plants, you get something like this, right? So you get, on one end, you get seagrass, which is almost always underwater, to seagrass that's sometimes open, sometimes underwater, and then salt marsh, and then your swamp forest, which is Melaleuca. We do have a lot of swamp forests in Tasmania, not in southern Tasmania, but in northern Tasmania. If you do get to Launceston, do check out the Tamar Wetlands Walk, and there's a great example of swamp forest there. So my own research, although I like all wetlands, I've focused primarily on salt marsh. I'll touch more on that in terms of the critters that live in there and what they get up to. This is another way I think about that landscape, apart from just looking at that across a spectrum. So if you want to look at this when you go traveling around the place, where are they? What do they look like? So I think of these as ridges behind the beaches. Remember the example I gave you of Wineglass Bay Beach? So the next time you go to a beach, you probably end up in a beach in the summer most of the time. And you get bored on the beach, like I do, then go for a wander, right? Go for a wander behind the beach, and you invariably would find a wetland of some description behind the beach. Okay, so here's one example. Around the east coast of Tasmania, and there's a lot of these around the east coast of Tasmania, where you have the beach, and behind that sand barrier, where all the waves are crashing in, you have these secluded environments, and around these secluded environments you have these wonderful wetlands that are so rich in wildlife. And what wildlife specifically, I'll get to that next. Right, so before I get to talking about wildlife, I want to tell you a bit about my favorite wetland, and I'd like to hear about your favorite wetlands at some stage. So where is my favorite wetland? It is the biggest and most significant wetland in Tasmania, and it is hiding in plain sight. You can actually see it in a map that scale. Where is it? Do you see a halo in that map? And that halo is right there. So if you follow the halo, you'll get to the Bollinger Bay Robbins Passage wetlands. Okay, and they are absolutely remarkable. So that's a couple. I've got a couple of photos. That's one photo of it. Here's a fun fact. The fun fact is that the length of the open tidal flats, and remember the tide comes in twice a day. As the tide comes in, the whole area is covered in water, up to 2 meters deep. When the tide goes out, this is what you get: bare sand. So the length of this sand is 4 to 5 kilometers. So you need to walk 4 to 5 kilometers just to get to the edge of the water. Put that in context of Hobart Airport runway, is 3 kilometers. So you can actually land a couple of jumbo jets here and you'll be fine, right? So quite remarkable in terms of that scale. But also in terms of the habitats there, and I've asked some of my students to guess where this photo was taken from, and some of them said kakadu. Right, so this is looking remarkable. Couldn't possibly be in good old Tassie, but it is. It is in the northwest of Tasmania, where we've got a quarter of all of our salt marsh over there. So now I want to get into. Okay, so we've talked about all of these wetland types, and hopefully you'll keep an eye out for them. So what actually happens there? What lives in those environments? Which is what I want to get to next. So we put this diagram together to answer that question: what lives in these wetland environments? And you can see there's the plants, there's microorganisms, there's crabs, snails, insects, water bird, other sorts of birds, and fish. Okay, and there's a lot of things that happen there in terms of how these wetlands function, which I'll get to a bit later as well. Okay. So I've walked a lot around these wetlands, and this is an example in high tide, and it's an interesting one because as I was walking here, there were hundreds of fish, and sometimes I was worried if I might actually step on a few and do them an injury, so I have to sort of shoo them away before I put my foot down, and this is what I mean. So this is an example of a photo taken just in that 10-20 centimeter water column. And there's just one fish. There's hundreds of these little fish there. I've got a few samples here, which I'll show you in a few minutes. So what are the fish doing there? And the fish are there to eat crab larvae. Again, there's hundreds of crabs there, which is the other trouble when you're walking in these environments. There's crabs everywhere, and sometimes you can't walk without crushing a few crabs, and you hear these exoskeletons under your shoes, and it's the most horrible feeling, right? But there are hundreds of them. How do you even get from one place to another without walking on a few? Okay, and when the water drains, you get these insects. There are hundreds of insects again. And what are the insects doing? They're feeding the birds, right? And they're again lots of these wonderful birds. I'll make a note of that particular bird there, which is a bird that I got on my T-shirt here. It is a white-fronted chat. It is a coastal bird, and in Tasmania it's still one of the best places in the world to see white-fronted chats. They also occur across Victoria and New South Wales, but their populations have reduced there, and Tasmania is still a stronghold. And I see them as an icon of our wetlands because they're always there, and they've got this wonderful sound like a guitar pick, ting, ting. And they're flipping around and sitting there, posing magnificently to photos and picking on insects. Okay, now we come to fish. Okay, so these wetlands are wonderful fish nurseries. Okay, so if you've ever had fish, if you like eating fish, then spare a thought for wetlands. These are fish nurseries. You can see in that photo to the left there. There's hundreds of them. So we're scooping them out to see what kind of fish there are, how many fish there are, and what we're finding is that our wetlands in Tasmania, density in terms of fish per square metre is higher than other parts of Australia. So we should be proud of our wetlands in Tassie. There's small fish, there's big fish, and some fish you can actually harvest. They're above legal size for harvest. And also lots of crabs, right? So the crabs try to eat the fish and the fish try to eat the crabs. So it's a wild environment if you're out there when the water's coming in. So I've got a few more photos of the fish, and photos are, not as good. I've got real samples here. So probably now is a good time to change our focus and look at some real samples.
Oh, wow.
Okay,
You've got lots of samples there, Vishnu.
Yeah, I do. And so we'll start with the biggest one here. So we caught this in a wetland right in the middle of it. It was really large when we caught it, and since then, as I put them in ethanol, they've shrunk a fair bit.
Oh.
So we've all heard of the Atlantic salmon. We do have native salmon. We have 2 species of native salmon. And this is an example of native salmon. It's a Western Australian salmon and a very vigorous swimmer.
So how big was it when you first caught it?
It was 20 centimeters.
And it's shrunk right down.
That's right. So it's shrunk to about maybe 10 centimeters now. And in the wild, they can get up to a meter long.
Wow, that's a big fish.
It is a big fish. Mm-hmm. And since that's the thing, that these habitats are nurseries. So they're shallow environments, lots of food to eat. So the younger members of the fish, the juveniles, come into these shallow environments, feed up, and then go back with the water.
Is it also that it's a sort of more calm environment for little fish?
It is precisely,
yeah.
But also in these environments, they're not at risk of being eaten by the bigger fish.
Yep.
Because the bigger fish, they tend to stay in deeper water.
Right. Oh, so it's a perfect environment for them then.
It's absolutely perfect, tailor-made for them. In fact, people who have worked this out in Victoria have started a program called Sponsor a Fish Hotel.
Sponsor a fish hotel. That's great. So a wetland.
Yeah, wetland. Yeah. That's right. So
so
they're collecting contributions.
Yeah.
And protecting wetlands because they are fish hotels.
That's great.
Right. So what are they eating? That's a good question.
Some tiny little things.
Yeah.
There.
So these are free floating little critters, and hopefully you can see that. So there's one example there. There's another one, and there's another one.
These are very tiny.
These are very tiny, and the fish love eating them. And I mentioned crabs. I'll give you a couple of examples of them. So here's a crab, and this is much smaller than some of the larger crabs. The larger crabs are probably that big, and the smaller ones. I do have an example here. That's my little finger.
That is so small.
Yeah, that's it. So that is it's yeah. Yeah,
were they bigger when you caught them and they've shrunk as well?
No,
or
the crabs
are the same.
They're the same because they've got the exoskeleton,
right?
Which doesn't.
So that is really tiny.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So the other big fish that you saw in my slides are these. These are yellow eye mullets. People catch salmon, mullets commercially and recreationally. So the mullets they come in all sizes. So these are really small ones. These are a bit bigger, and we did catch ones that are 25 centimeters wide as well. These are again vigorous swimmers, and they love salt marsh. We catch a lot of these. The other large numbers of fish that we catch are these hardy heads, and they've got this stripe, and they're semi-transparent in the water, and there's large schools of them. So if you around these environments, if you see really large schools of fish, it's likely to be hardy heads. And then you have gobies, and again there's a lot of gobies in the water. It's one of the most common fish species you'll find in these environments. And what you see here is that they've got these little suckers, and they are bottom dwelling species, so they use those suckers to hang on to the bottom. Against the current.
Yes.
Yeah, so they're good at doing that. And the last one I'll probably show you is this flounder, and these again, lay on the bottom of the ocean, seafloor and wetlands, and they're like a mini UFO floating around in wetlands, and they go around like this, like a disc. And again, that's a juvenile.
They're amazing.
Yeah, wonderful.
Vishnu, we might have our 5-minute break.
Yep.
So everyone, we're going to go to our break, and in that time, if you've got some questions for Vishnu, you can post them onto the chat, and don't forget your name and your grade and your school, and we'll see you in 5 minutes. Oh, great, we're back. We love technical difficulties on UCTV Alive for Kids. Vishnu, what do you wear when you're exploring wetlands?
That's a good question. Safety is first and foremost, and I make sure that I have waders or gaiters with me.
The big pants.
Big pants when you're walking out in deep water.
Yeah.
If you're just camping, you're probably not likely to be carrying them with you. Gumboots are great. Gumboots are wonderful. They're cheap, accessible, and my 5-year-old has a little one, blue color, really pretty, and that's what he wears when he comes exploring with me, and it's perfect.
Sounds good. So remember your gumboots in the back of the car is a good tip. Here's a question for you. Now, this is from Luke. He's in grade 6 and he's homeschooled. Hi, Luke. Do the extra tannins in the water after a big rain event affect the fish in a wetland? Oh, what a good question.
Yeah, good question. The fish would have adapted to that environment to be able to deal with the tannin. The question is if the tannin concentrates over time. If it concentrates over time, it can reduce light infiltration into the wetland environment, and that would affect the plants in the wetland environment. And this is something that we are seeing, for instance, in Macquarie Harbour, where the tannin and the lack of flushing into the Macquarie Harbour has resulted in a really difficult environment for fish, and so we're seeing a different set of fish that have adapted to that environment, that are suited to that environment.
Vishnu, as we're coming towards the end of the episode, we have to ask the question. To what question is wetland the answer?
Well, I'm hoping that having listened to me talk, students would be able to ask the question and provide the answers themselves. But I'm going to try with a couple of questions, all right? So what am I going to have for dinner? That's the question. And how is wetland an answer for that? I probably think you know the answer too. Well, you could say, I'm going to have fish and chips. Okay, so if you're having fish and chips, where do all the fish come from? The fish need wetland environments as nurseries as they're little, before they go into the open ocean, before they're caught, and then transported to supermarkets and buy them and cook them, right? So that's one question. And then you could say, well, I'm a vegetarian. So what am I going to have for dinner in that case, and how is that linked to wetlands? And I could say, well, you might be eating rice, and rice is a wetland grass, and rice paddocks are a great example of wetlands. In fact, some of the rice paddocks in Asia have been listed under the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands as internationally significant wetlands. Rice paddocks, where rice is being produced, also is a remarkable habitat for birds. Some of the most majestic birds in the world, like the Sarus crane, they depend on rice paddocks, right? So that's another question.
That's it.
That's it.
Oh. Well, listen, Vishnu, that's all we have time for this episode. Thank you so much for coming on to UCTV Alive for Kids. It was absolutely wonderful.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. Now, as I said, that's all we have time for this week. Now, this is, of course, our last episode for 2021. So I'd like to thank all the presenters we've had on the show this year for coming on, their incredible contribution, just like Vishnu, sharing their knowledge with all of us. A huge thank you to our producers, Stuart and Tess, who make sure that the show goes out every fortnight and find all of the wonderful presenters to come on air. And of course, a big thank you to you and your teachers for watching and tuning in every fortnight. We've got a great year coming up next year. We'll see you next year. Have a wonderful break. See you in 2022.